And hello, good morning, and good afternoon to everyone. It's now 11:04 here on the west coast of America, and I'm glad you're all here today. My name is Larry LaMotte. I'm your host, and this webinar is being recorded, and it will be made available online. So let's begin. Forgive me, I do have a cold, so if I have to mute momentarily and do stuff for that, or if my voice starts cracking like I'm 14 again, please forgive me. But we will move on. All righty. At ReCapturit, my company, we are passionate stewards of salvage, extending the life of building materials and buildings with three things: the solution to construction waste, the place to shop for and sell treasures of recaptured building materials at ReCapturit.com, and what we're talking about today, which is help for cities to craft clear and effective reuse incentives and policy, which is the broad scope of today's discussion as part of what we call the Deconstruction Policy Accelerator. We've entered into the world of planning and policy with cities and counties across the U.S. This webinar is the fifth in an ongoing series of webinars and workshops provided to educate, inform, and even hopefully inspire officials and sustainability champions to understand the need to move forward toward deconstruction from the total demolition and disposal of buildings. Yeah, these are not paper plates we're tossing away. These are thrown away. We are throwing away whole buildings all day, every day. Each one of our events, our webinars and workshops builds onto the other. So no two are the same. Workshops get into more detail and more how-to. All of our work of us at ReCapturit and these gentlemen today is part of the circular economy. That, simply put, is extending the life of things by finding new ways to reuse these things once their original purpose has been served. It's like wood in a barn becomes part of a house. A steel beam in a factory finds a second home in a modern commercial building. A vintage sink finds new life in a Victorian home remodel. This webinar is going to be practical, high-level conversation with two what I think are exceptional thinkers and doers. They know how to look at what is to examine a practice or a process. They take it apart like an old car, and then they see how to use what is still good, and while making things better for its future. So, question: what is the largest waste-producing set of practices in the world? Construction and demolition waste. What is the single best solution for eliminating that? Deconstruction and reuse of buildings and recaptured building materials. So, this month's topic: how to start right to stop huge waste. And that's me. Goofy picture, but most of mine are. Your host, and I'm the CEO and the founder of ReCapturit at ReCapturit.com and the Deconstruction Policy Accelerator, but that's not the meat of the matter today. Here's our panelists today, and I'm very excited to be here with them today. Jean-Paul Miralda goes by JP. JP is the Chief Operating Officer of Emerge, which is in Dallas, which he lives in Dallas, Fort Worth, Texas, and Garr Punnett, the CEO of Loop Layer, and he's out of Chicago, Illinois. Clickety click.
Go Chicago.
Go Chicago. Just a second here. I'm bumping ahead here. Let me tell you a little bit about each of them. But first, we're going to go through a series of questions with both of these gentlemen today. And then if you have questions, put them into the chat here below. Find that little bubble that is the chat bubble, and drop your questions into the chat so that we can answer them at the end of the conversation with these two. So Jean-Paul Miralda, JP, has degrees in management engineering and mechanical engineering. In his work, from product manager to process manager to transformation manager to chief operating officer, JP has been a leader in everything he's done. He summed up the work he does now for Emerge very nicely. We intentionally refrain from calling them, which are solutions, frameworks or methodologies, as these concepts have boxed in innovation instead of allowed it to evolve with the nuance of human experience in mind. Pretty nice, huh? Garr Punnett has degrees in economics and sustainability solutions. He comes from parents in radio talk shows, though, and he inherited a gene or two from those two, and the skills involved with that. So catch his podcast sometime. He did interviews on the Oprah Winfrey Network, by the way. But sustainability is where he finds satisfaction. He worked at a company called Reaply, a resource exchange platform, also working in reuse. It's a very cool company. He was employee number 5 for 4.5 years then, 4.5 years. And then he had the entrepreneurial itch, scratch pretty hard, and he had to scratch back. So he started Loop Layer this spring and is working very hard to get that going strong. We're excited to have these two innovative men here with us today and share their knowledge and to instill hope for our future. Change is hard, though. Change still needs to happen. Our very thinking needs to change. And these two can help with that. But let me prime this pump and then we'll get started. Here's a little few quotes from some of my favorites. R. Buckminster Fuller, the designer of the geodesic dome, who my shop teacher in junior high school was good friends with and used to call him Bucky. You can never change things by fighting the existing reality. To change something, build a new model that makes the old model obsolete. And this guy knew a thing or two about thinking. The thinking that got us to where we are is not the thinking that will take us to where we want to be. Albert Einstein. And then from this morning in my reading time, future-proof your organization. Some things have to be purposefully broken and changed. You have to push innovation and force adaptation to ensure resilience. And then we'll close up with this last priming of the pump from Cindy Alvarez, who wrote the book Lean Customer Development. You don't want to hear the official process. You need to know all the secret grumblings and workarounds that people have patched together to get their jobs done. Those are the insights you need to build an incredible product or service. So I originally had the title for this to part it out to start it out, which spoke to taking something apart to understand it and then using its parts again in the old stuff in new ways. Something that really came out of my conversations with these two gentlemen was that they both have strong abilities to deconstruct what is and rethink how to make parts better and thus improve the whole. So JP told me that the name of the company he works with, Emerge, named their company because they like to merge in with the existing rather than disrupt and break things up and make a mess of everything. So anyway, I threw that in there. It's just a little doodle I had when from way back when. Okay, now let's take fresh, incisive thinking and delve into problems to find opportunity and solutions with our friends and panelists here today, Garr, Punnett, and JP Miralda. I'm going to stop screen sharing. Y'all can look at each other. Now you can all see one another. Hi, everybody. Wow, look at all these faces. Hi. So, greetings, Garr and JP. Thanks for being here, fellas. Let's get into the questions. And we're going to tackle a couple of definitions first because, you know, we all get real familiar with things and then that's our jargon and it's, you know, just same old to us. But hey, JP, I'll let you take sustainability first. And my wife and I were watching a comedy TV show last weekend, Ted Lasso, hysterical show, by the way. In one episode, Ted's family came out to the soccer field, the football pitch in England where he worked as a coach. And he saw them arrive and began sprinting across the field to greet his family. A player looked at him running full out top speed and said, "I don't think he knows how far that is. That pace is not sustainable." Well, I had to laugh. Sustainable, yeah, not. Sustainability in comedy? Nice. So, JP, give us a quick non-comical, if you would, foundation of what that term means, and then please tell us how your work seeks to bring more sustainable practices to your clients, and maybe give us an example. Thanks.
Absolutely. Larry, first of all, very happy to be here and share the stage here with Garr as well. I think both of you have a lot more experience on this public arena than I do, so I'll do my best. But I really appreciate you having me. And I think, you know, talking about sustainability, it's such a broad concept that has honestly morphed and changed over time. I think our generation has seen this shift happen over time and how it went from just reuse, reduce, recycle, and then it started shifting to circularity, which I know Garr will kind of talk about a little more in depth. And then now there's this new concept about regeneration as well, right? So it's not just about how do we fix what's happened, but how do we start making it better again? Because now we know we've kind of screwed up a little bit, right? So there's these new concepts of how do we then regenerate as well what we've taken. But with that evolution, I think something that has stuck with the concept of sustainability over time has been the concept of resilience, right? And really a huge synonymous with resilience is sustainability. And it's this idea of really creating practices, processes, materials, resources, and systems that are going to ensure that they can thrive over time in the long term, not just for our generation, but for the next ones as well, without providing any compromises, right, with what exists today. And I think that's the key. And, you know, alluding back to the comical version that you mentioned as well, right, is, you know, it was not going to be sustainable for him to run that long. It wasn't going to thrive over time, right? It was going to eventually succumb and fall apart at that pace. So I think the concept is very broad, and this doesn't only apply from a sustainability with the lens that's been seen over the last 20 years in terms of just the planet itself, but also thinking of the businesses, right? How do you make a business sustainable? How do you go through things like COVID, through pandemics, and make a future-proof organization, to one of your previous quotes, that can really be resilient through these times and become sustainable as a business itself, right? So there's a couple of different applications of the word sustainability that come into play, that all kind of allude to the same concept, because it can be applied to, you know, processes and materials alike, as well as businesses. So that, I would say, is my kind of simple way of viewing sustainability and what it really means and how it's evolved over time. I would say at Emerge, we've taken that concept and really apply it at this convergence of, you know, technology, right, and all these emerging technologies. So we use a lot of blockchain, AI, a lot of machine learning, a lot of these new concepts and new emerging technologies. We know a lot of companies are saying, oh, people are doing AI, let's do it as well, right? And we're saying, hey, before you just throw technology as a solution into something, and think of how you actually integrate this in a sustainable and impactful way to your long-term view, right? So we're saying the two sides of sustainability at the same time. One, be greener, be friendly to the planet, you know, improve your processes, but at the same time, think about how this is going to sustain over the long. And we've seen, you know, so much of that happen, especially the rapid increase in technology and its applications, right, over the last 20 years, how we just slap solutions and things are starting to really fall apart in a lot of businesses in terms of internal, you know, technology networks and things like that. So our huge component here is saying, where is your customer? Meet them where they are, right? And I know we'll talk a little bit more in depth of that later. Put in the right solution, the right practices for what they need, but at the same time, build it into your business strategy so that you can build a resilient and future-proof organization that can go through all these tough times that we've been going through in the last couple of years.
Nice. Absolutely. Thank you. That was beautiful. I appreciate that. All right. Garr, we're going to jump over to you, sir. You and I have talked a good bit about circular economy and circularity, speaking of some jargony terms out there that are that we understand well, but they're sort of well.
Oh, and through our conversations, I might even go with this the whole conversation without saying those two words. That's almost my goal.
Okay, good. All right. Well, just so others have an established foundation of that. You know that circular is a seemingly simple word for a complex subject, but you're going deep into that in your business pursuits. And could you give us some clarity on that for the basic definition of circularity as it relates to a physical product or a process, and why is that increasingly important?
Yeah, I thank you. I've been thinking about all these word choices lately, as I work on both the podcast, what I'm writing, what I'm trying to almost articulate, even in what the business purpose is. When we think about sustainability, yes, categorically, we're probably really trying to define our way into building or deconstructing systems and building those systems in order to harvest the materials, use less of the materials that we're extracting, create those regenerative systems, almost those positive impact systems. And I'll say it now, circular economy is just one more extension of that practice of sustainability. And ultimately, the last time, hopefully, maybe I'll say it with circular economy, a hugely encompassing word that really just means anything involving reuse, refurbishment, sharing, remanufacturing, which I can get more into, and then ultimately and lastly, maybe recycling in some way, either mechanical, chemical, organic in some capacity, whether using it as a feedstock of feeding materials. But ultimately, all of those are what encompass circular economy. So what I've been actually very conscious of lately is not trying to greenwash circular economy too much and just using it. Kind of actually, Larry, you challenged me on this, of using it so often that it loses its meaning. So I'm very focused on remanufacturing, and remanufacturing is the practice of a little bit heavier than refurbishment. So you're not just taking a vacuum back and polishing it up and then selling it back, cleaning the bags and cleaning the intake or whatever you might do, and then selling it back on the market. This is wholesale a different industry. This is an industry in which you are taking back, I mean, various amounts of industrial components from aerospace, transportation, office furniture, which is very popular right now given our relaxing, complicated, and also morphing relationship we have with our own offices. But also heavy industry, so the Caterpillars, the John Deeres, and then also tire scrap and the tire retreading industry. So remanufacturing is when you're taking any of those components back and you're breaking them down to their individual components. And really that can be from a, let's take an engine block. We're going to strip that down into its individual components. We will clean it, we can remachine it, and then ultimately it'll be repainted and then spec'd so that it's almost entirely new, except for the biggest difference, which is it's using 99% fewer materials, up to 99% fewer materials and emissions for what is now the same product. So the difference between a remanufactured item and a new item might be very little difference in its actual performance, but a huge impact in terms of what it's taking a toll on water, even labor needed, because that's going to be a boost to labor. But then ultimately those energy emissions as well, and then the impact associated with the material extraction. So remanufacturing in a nutshell, enormous across many different industries. And I can dive a little bit deeper into why we don't know as much about remanufacturing, because it's a fascinating industry.
Okay, good. Yeah, remanufacturing is what I've gotten one of the later questions for you. So you can hit on that in a few minutes, but thank you for that much so far. So we've had some interesting conversations around the whole thing of circularity. And one point that I always like to add into that is that you don't have to be the whole circle.
Right. You just have to be 15 minutes of the whole
15
clock?
15 minutes on the clock. Yep. 20 minutes on the clock.
A minute of the clock. Exactly.
Yep, exactly.
Just be a part of that whole circle. Yeah.
Right. Yep. Okay. Thanks. JP, I am constantly personally looking at processes, even in daily life. I think about the sequence of getting the frying pan hot first, so that while I'm mixing the pancake batter, the frying pan's heating up simultaneously, right? So there's no waiting for that to heat up when you get the batter ready, right? Well, that's a process, and processes are everywhere. And we can often do them better. And sometimes they are broken, outdated, or not serving the needs. So the sequencing of steps is very important. Things can happen in parallel, going at the same time, or in series where one depends on another, or both. And it helps to understand the context you're working in, though, right? JP, you told me a fascinating story about a project your firm handled in Africa that created a truly sustainable process to provide microloans to those who could not qualify due to what we might think were unusual conditions. Please tell us about that and how you dissected the context and deconstructed the process paths, used empathy and understood the sequences, and looked at what was to create what is.
Yeah, absolutely, Larry. I wholeheartedly, as a process person, obviously I see processes everywhere, but that's just kind of in my nature. But it's always fascinating to see and understand and find ways to deconstruct processes in a way that it truly could be helpful in the future. So to dive into the example that you're mentioning for the audience here, this was a project with the Kasese region in Uganda, in Africa, and the government there actually approached us because they were looking for, how to the solutionism aspect of it, right, initially, right? So they were, hey, we see blockchain, we think it can really help with farmland. and finding ways to help these farmers in this region. It's a region that's very disconnected from today's like financial world or economic world completely in the region. So they were trying to find ways and say, hey, it's a fresh new start. Let's just throw blockchain at it. We came back and with what we've talked about so far, we said, hey, throwing technology as a solution doesn't really solve the problem generally. We need to understand kind of where these people are. And so our team actually took the time to go grounds with our partners and work with people there and where they were today, right? And what they don't have technology there, right? They had smartphones. That was about it. There's no Wi-Fi. There's no servers. Where are you going to host all this information, right? So we said, hey, the solution here is a great thought, but we're not meeting the needs of the actual stakeholders that you're trying to engage with. And so through a lot of collaborations and a lot of these organizations and groups, right, especially on a one of the things we said was actually, well, what if you are already self-organized, how are your lands organized? And this actually created a mapping of the farmlands in a tenth of a time that it would have taken for the government to go with a measuring stick, right? Walk around and figure like, here's your land, here's your land. They already had this all sorted out. It was just a matter of actually being able to record it. And that's where, the blockchain and a ledger kind of concept really came in handy. But we said, hey, look, there's no need to disrupt, right, the way that they're doing their work today, particularly in an area that's already sustainable. They're already working. All they needed was really this access to the financial aspects of it. And so to really solve for that, I said, well, they have smartphones or phones in general, right? Not all of them were smart. So the solution was, well, what if they have a SMS text, right? And they text a random number like you do here in the US, right? A text, the process, whatever the codes were into 99555 or something like that. And then that actually got recorded and transcribed into the blockchain. There was no need for them to go through a whole learning curve of what's blockchain, how does this apply, right? These were people that were not even exposed to the internet necessarily. So the learning curve was going to be massive, but they were already functioning very well. And so it was really about how do we adopt the solution in an empathic way so that these people actually adopt it in a sustainable manner. Today, there's over 40,000 farmers using this process.
I'm happy to fill this real quickly, Larry. Larry, you're on.
I'm muted. Now I'm, yeah. Yep. Okay. Yeah. Please continue there, Garr, while, yeah.
JP, please, when you hear me, I will stop. So please just give me the signal. Well, I'll dive down really again into remanufacturing. So I hadn't talked about loop layer just yet. And we were talking about how loop layer, ultimately my goal is to build a software platform in a SaaS model that can help manufacturers get a better understanding of how they can track their products, get a better understanding of how they can create more of a potentially collaborative but accessible partner supply chain. And that's mostly because no manufacturer can probably solve this themselves. They're very linearly focused. So their job is to create items and sell those items through their distribution channels, through their other sales types of referral networks, whatever that is. So my bet is that they actually need something to help them create their partner ecosystem better, to help create that reverse supply chain. So ultimately, that's where loop layer is focused, is try to build the software to help those companies do that just a little bit easier. Where I was particularly interested in is in the US, we don't know a whole lot about remanufacturing because as an entire separate category that is remanufacturing, the US government has actually grouped it in under manufacturing. So the way that we operate in understanding the data associated with certain industries is we all have our North American, I'm forgetting what it's called. These are our NAICS codes. These are our North American, maybe I could Google it really quickly, information system types of codes, where that's how we track the data associated with our industries. And remanufacturing doesn't have its own NAICS code. And so from a US government standpoint, it's not recognized as its own industry. And then from a global standpoint, there's actually a lot of misinformation that goes around of what's used versus remanufactured, what's used and ready to be remanufactured in a separate industry, maybe in a separate nation that might have their own economy associated with remanufacturing. And so there's actually these very gray lined types of industries in which, in the absence of clarity of what is remanufacturing, you actually have a lack of understanding, again, of how does this affect different economies, who's embracing remanufacturing, who's excelling at remanufacturing, both across industries and economies, whether that's in Asia, the North America, and African nations, and then even the EU nations that are all trying to embrace it, but in their own very different ways, because it's still not a very almost codified industry or codified science yet.
Yeah, that's so true in other ways. I mean, I think that the terminology for construction and demolition waste is a misnomer. It should be construction
Yes.
and demolition and deconstruction byproducts. All that, though, that's way too long, because once you label it waste, it's waste, right? But it's not necessarily. So anyway,
yeah,
but
it's
that
like
speaks to what you're talking about. Yeah,
it's us like trying to rebrand C&D into construction and deconstruction. It's like, well,
yeah,
that's not how the language everyone talks, but
no,
ultimately,
exactly.
yes, that's the goal. Is we have a burgeoning deconstruction economy. How do we
Mhm.
keep the information going where more data can be supplied to support more policy? I saw a couple people here. I see Ramsey County. Molly, if you're involved in that, excellent. Thank you for being here. I grew up in St. Paul, so go Ramsey County. But ultimately, that's where, it's all about supplying that data and supplying the information to support the policy and support more deconstruction ordinances and different, frankly, policy makers.
Yes, yes.
JP's
So,
back, so
yep,
I'm
he is back.
good. I'm jumping off the mic.
Thanks for filling in there, Garr. And we're going to skip a question because you kind of invented your own, which is fabulous. I'm going to go right into JP's next question. And generally speaking, change is hard. And if you have to persuade people to voluntarily change how they do something they are currently doing, how important is it to understand what they do and how they currently get something done? What is the value of understanding and deconstructing the steps of the what is before proceeding to design something new, which is sort of what you were talking about in your last question answer. And can you take off from there? What's the value of understanding that deconstruction of those steps and finding the what is?
Larry, this might be me again.
Oh my gosh, we lost him again. Yep. Okay. Well, must be a bandwidth.
What do we want to talk about? Ask me whatever you want on this one.
Okay. Well, let's let's just go to the next one. So, and this one talks about your new business, Loop Layer. You would like to talk about that, right? And
of course.
Of course. And you've been considering many possibilities to create positive impact. There are many categories of products which can be made more sustainable and circular, some of which you've already named, but automobile parts, clothing and fashion, electronics, appliances, industrial manufacturing equipment, you talked about that, furniture, yeah, and of course, building materials. You can positively affect the products and the processes, or both. So how have you been deconstructing? How do you think about industries to understand where there are opportunities for value creation?
JP, do you want to give us a quick thumbs up?
I'm back.
Excellent. I'm going to take this real quickly, and the next one's going to come right to you. In which the way that I view deconstructing an industry is really almost started from contract furniture manufacturing. So working with Reaply, our goal when we were really working with our internal clients was really focused on how do we scale reuse? How do we go to a large client and help them build a system of which they can source their own inventory from themselves? And that's a trickier concept in practice, which is really all businesses are designed to do their core function. They are less designed to think about all the waste that they produce and how to actually create their own circular economies within themselves. So their own sharing, their own reuse, their own refurbishment, remanufacturing. Where I became particularly obsessed in breaking down these systems is we actually had a big shakeup. We had COVID. JP mentioned it earlier. It was the big, almost a big equalizer in terms of who's both sustainable in practice and in thinking about their future material use, but who's sustainable in their own business models. And when COVID really hit, and we've now seen the repercussions of this, is there are now significant vacancies in offices around the country. So because of that, we're both seeing a shift in probably zoning for a lot of these offices, in which that's going to now mean a possible deconstruction types of activity where you're shifting offices from one to another. But also, you're now actually looking at a wholesale change of a relationship between us and the spaces we occupy. I'm probably curious, out of all of us on this call, who's actually at home right now. And it probably is more exactly right. I mean, it's probably a lot of us. It's my 90% of us. So thank you everybody for the hands up, digital and in person. So, but ultimately, where I became more obsessed with this is, okay, well, how is the contract furniture industry viewing that change, where primarily their sales structure was focused towards selling to businesses, and they would sell through dealerships. Well, now they actually need to start rethinking. Okay, all the people that are working from home, well, they want great opportunities for chairs and for these fantastic pieces of equipment that we sit in. I'm sitting in a refurbished steel case task chair. I think other people have another types of other chairs from Hayworth, Knoll, which is now part of Miller Knoll, and then even the classic Aeron chair that is so valuable. But all of those were actually top-notch products that are being thrown out every day. Larry, as you mentioned before, we're having buildings that are being deconstructed, demolished every day. Those are all once occupied by chairs that are now actually looking for new homes. But those new homes shouldn't be towards the liquidators. They shouldn't be towards other types of donation schemes. They should actually probably be, well, really being pulled back into some sort of reverse supply chain and be able to be resold. And that's a program that ultimately is aspirational more than practice right now, as the volumes are not that impressive yet. We're still in the 1% to 2% threshold of high quality office furniture, furniture that's going to get reused, as opposed to the other 98% that's going to be thrown out. And so how do we scale those reuse, those refurbishment, that remanufacturing outcome to really drive that furniture back into frankly, just new sales pipelines? That's what it's really about. If we can scale that, well, then we can sell reuse. We just need to figure out how to get the furniture back. And so to your original question, then it's all about, well, how do we figure out those points in that reverse supply chain, and then really make a product that fits every one of those stakeholders? JP, that's kind of where we left off, actually, was with stakeholders, and really figuring out, okay, what's actually servicing those stakeholders and making their lives easier, not just prescribing a solution with technology that ultimately isn't benefiting anyone other than a headline.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
JP, you want to take off on that point a bit?
Yeah, no, first, I'll apologize for the technology issues. As Larry, you might know, and for context for everybody, new father here. I've been off in parental leave for the last 3 weeks so far. Happy, healthy baby boy, but have not opened my computer in 3 weeks. Hence, everything decided to update right in the middle of the call. So here I am on my phone instead. But yeah, no, I think, from a standpoint of meeting the stakeholders, right? I think, Garr, what you're saying is incredibly important, right? I think that's something that we've also started seeing with some of our customers is really understanding, that mass of scale, and how do you actually start promoting some of these things? You start to need some of that momentum, right? And as more people want to participate, more people come into play, you create more of that economy of where this reuse, deconstruct some of these aspects really come into play, and they become part of the norm, right? And not necessarily this like new concept, or I'm thinking of organic foods and in the food industry as well, right? How some of these things started super expensive because nobody was consuming them, but as more and more of this becomes an awareness and more people are consuming it, the prices are coming down and trying to really start to be comparable with what non-organic things are. And that same aspect needs to happen in almost every industry, right? Where we need to deconstruct and reconstruct some of the processes and some of the ways that we've treated the cycles of the materials within these industries and resources that are being used into it. But yeah, to the point of the stakeholders, I think that's what's really important is really understanding where people are today and what the needs are. And to some extent, I love, Garr, that you try not to use some of the buzzwords, right? Because we try to do the same thing. And Gary and Larry alluded to my concept of these frameworks, right? Because everyone's, oh, here's our framework to do this. And we're like, well, no, you're actually boxing stuff in, right? And when we start coining some of these terms as well, we start boxing things into this is what it is. And we're not allowing some of those concepts to really take off. So I think, in many ways, as I was alluding to, probably when I cut off, we didn't need to explain blockchain to farmers in Uganda, right? That didn't ultimately matter to them. It's a technology that's underpinned. There's somebody that has to understand it, of course, right? Somebody has to help maintain it and, make it sustainable use for them. But at the end of the day, what they really cared about was, where do I send this message to? And this is going to lead me to being able to secure financial freedom, financial loans for myself. That is what they wanted. And that is what they needed as an end consumer. Yes, we had the middleman of the government itself, right? And what they were needing. But there, you have to really understand where all these people stand in the process itself, right? And one of the practices that I love to do personally, and as my years of project management and process management, has been really talking to the people at every level of the process, right? So as you map this out, many times you do it with, more senior leaders, with people that understand the full picture, right? And you can really get into what the processes are. But then I always ask, who is doing this, right? And when I get to that ground level, I always make it a point to speak to at least one person of each one of those roles that's participating in that process. Because just by that conversation, you uncover so many low-hanging fruits or so many small process tweaks, right, that can be done that can make things much more sustainable, much more easier, much more, friendly to the end user in terms of how they're doing things today. That sometimes it doesn't even require changing full platforms, right, or using brand new technology to do it. It's a matter of, fixing a couple buttons and a couple clicks in the technologies that you already have. So I think in many ways that concept kind of applies across all industries in terms of, talking construction here, right, is, some of these things can be refurbished, reused in different ways, and materials that are still in great conditions, right, can be reused in many ways just by understanding kind of what the next person really needs from it.
Absolutely. Great. Thank you. Yeah. One thing I really, really enjoyed out of your description of that when you and I spoke, JP, was that these people were establishing patterns of transactions, and those transactions were not in money. We're not in coins and bills and credit cards. They were in chickens and goats and so forth, but they were legitimate bartered transactions of exchanges of value. And they codified each one of those onto the blockchain, which, like you said, they didn't care about blockchain. They just knew they could go to their phone, dial a 5-digit number and go deet, 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 and then it's done and it's registered. And that gave them a pattern of transactions that banks could then say, oh, they actually are doing, transactions and doing that sort of work in an established pattern, and could then be given a granted a loan based on that, instead of exchanging money and credit card transactions. I thought that was fascinating. That was so cool. So anyway, thank you, sir. We got 2 questions left, and I'm going to switch it up a little bit because we've switched it up a little bit. I'm going to hit Garr up next, and getting a little bit more specific here, Garr. You spoke with me about an intriguing theme to approach, and you touched on it a little here earlier today, for enhancing longevity of products and thus making them more sustainable. And the term you used was cores. And cores are essentially parts or components of a product, be that cars, industrial equipment, laptops, appliances, or whatever, that has exchangeable parts that can be updated, upgraded, and so forth. And this speaks to less obsolescence, which is a beautiful thing, and many other advantages, and also to circularity. Would you speak to that topic of transforming an industry to circularity using core components, and hopefully incorporating used building materials if you can, and all the better? So fire away.
I will, this has been the fun part about my journey into building Loop Layer, which is I'm 5 months in, and I'm diving deeper and deeper into the niche of which I found myself in sustainability. Then it was circular economy, and now it's even further into remanufacturing. So the management of cores and the management of the financial aspect of cores is still something that's relatively new to me, but something I've been reading about for literally the last 30 days. I mean, I've been diving deep and just doing all the research I can. Now, what I can say about cores is the concept is fairly simple. A core is any piece of integral technology to the functioning of a unit, like the good. So we could take an office. I'll compare an engine to an office chair, because I ended with office chair the first time, which is, from an engine perspective, it might be any component that is, again, very particularly used in the function of that engine. So, and it's going to have a very defined value toward the block of which is that engine. So say an engine block has $100,000 value. Well, that's made up of all the other core components that go into the performance of that engine. So a core is really just anything you take out that without that component, the main product won't function. In a chair, of which we're all sitting in, you could think about it as that type of air piston that allows us to adjust and take our weight and fluctuate our height of the chair. You could think about it as the recline feature in the back that allows a certain amount of functionality that we all expect in a quality chair. So when we think about products, it's, well, how well are those components actually manufactured? That's going to be the difference between something that you get for $100 that's coming off of, let's just say, some type of transportation from another country that's very cheap, potentially cheaply made, and the difference between something that's US made by Steelcase or Miller Knoll or Hayworth, some of these quality manufacturers that are all based in, well, frankly, they're all based in Michigan, and they've been doing this work for 200 years. So ultimately, those difference in performance of components is what's going to define a core. Is, can you take that component out, and if you remachine it, is it going to perform to the exact degree of a new component? And so that's what we can think of as cores. Now, related to the building and the deconstruction industry, well, that's where this gets very interesting, is how do you start to look at doors as cores to the function of what we expect from a building? Door frames, windows, window frames, even anything that's involved in the infrastructure of our walls, whether that's some sort of siding component with gypsum, or the frames that hold those boards, or even the boards themselves. Those are all cores. They function over a series of events and time horizons that ultimately, if they're deconstructed, they will still perform to the degree of the expectation we have for a product. So ultimately, anything we do to service those cores, it should be able to re-service us in terms of its use. And so I like to think about doors, because we've got a great company, Doors Unhinged, in Pittsburgh, which is reclaiming doors and making sure that we can resell those doors. We've got I was just talking to Urban Machine out in Oakland, that's building robotics and AI technology to help de-nail 2x4s. A lot more than 2x4s. They do many different types of wood structures or wood planks. But ultimately, it's again servicing those cores that we have as wood. So anything that can be taken out and then sort of remachined, reprocessed minimally to then be reused in some type of structure, I would consider that a core in any sort of deconstruction. Any follow up there with that? I kind of like how that all played out. I kind of winged it, but I think it worked.
Well, hey, that was good winging.
Okay, good.
Yeah, no, that was excellent. And relating it down to things as simple as a door as core, that's very useful. So yeah, Doors Unhinged is a very cool company. And what Urban Machine you mentioned, Jory Wisniewski is here today on this call. She's the marketing genius over at Urban Machine. So she would probably have a few things to say about that.
I know she would. Yes.
Yeah. So, yeah. Thank you for expounding on what cores are, and that relates to some other things. And I'll turn it back into the building materials world. There's some really interesting companies working on windows, because thermal value of old windows. Who's lived in a cold climate where you have one pane windows, single pane windows, and you got the frost on the inside, and you scrape it off with your fingernails, and then they got the old double pane and so forth. There are now companies that can put a second layer, an insulative glass layer on the outside of old windows, and make them essentially technologically almost brand new windows. And that right there is a kind of a remanufacturing of a core element of a building, but they're doing it in situ, in place. So anyway, just expanding on what you had to say there. So let's go back to JP, because his bandwidth is apparently working well now. This is a long one. And it talks about the values within sustainability. So stick with me. So when creating solutions to entrenched problems, really, really entrenched problems, things that have been around for decades or maybe even 100 or more years, there are key aspects to be discovered and incorporated into a solution. Depending upon who is creating that solution and who is to respond can make a lot of difference. Different aspects are given a higher relative value. So if a new business, for example, absolutely needs customers, they may make their solution convenient and economical. If a government body is implementing something new, it may need expediency and trackability. And both may need security, safety, and high availability. But then, JP, the reason this question is directed at you is because it's about empathy. You and I spoke about this. You mentioned it today. When you think about affected stakeholders, you take into account what's important to the people who will be affected, not just some of them. So let me jump through a few of these value-related decisions and see how you respond to that. But what about maintaining or enhancing profitability for affected businesses? What about adaptability for longevity and thus sustainability and less obsolescence? What about simplicity? Engineers, and no offense, I know you're an engineer, engineers are infamous for feature creep, which means adding in more and more simply because, well, somebody might want it sometime, so let's just add it in there, right? Well, why not just include what's needed? And what about accessibility and equitability? How can things be made to allow greater access to a wider variety of people to something? And what about who gets access to the thing being made available and who decides where it goes and who gets the benefit? So JP, these are a lot of value-based factors. Like I said, how does the initial understanding of the problem in that part it out to start it out mentality affect the outcome in how you do your work, and which values do you make sure to address for sustainability? There's a big one.
That is a big one. Hopefully I won't cut out through this one. But no, I think, these are all extremely good questions that, we ask ourselves, and we also ask the customer, right? As we start the journey through this and think about resilience as that end goal, right? You need to factor in a lot of these concepts and a lot of these values into that idea, right? The only way you're going to become sustainable in the long term and have, the resilience as a business that's needed to endure all sorts of, different financial turmoils, different seasonalities, different ups and downs of the markets, all that kind of stuff, is if you're really in sync with your customer base, right? And really understanding what is absolutely necessary to meet the needs of who you're trying to serve. So who you're trying to serve always needs to come first, followed very closely, because it's business, by profitability, right? So we need to understand, when you're trying to build more sustainable, more regenerative financial models, is about, how do you incorporate all these aspects about sustainability into a way that you're serving your customer better, but still being profitable. And I think that's one of the big things that we try to address, because in the past, so many people have seen it as, hey, we're selling this XYZ product, right? But people are saying we need to be sustainable. So let's plant some trees on the side and we can say, hey, here's our sustainability card, right? That's no longer flying. Customers no longer think of that as sustainable. There's a lot of greenwashing, a lot of impact washing happening when people see that, right? And it's kind of very easy now to call it out, especially with all the new ESG frameworks and all this kind of stuff, where you can really track what impact a business is having. And so what we say is, no, you can integrate those two things together, right? You can be sustainable, you can be good for the planet while being profitable. And that comes at the expense of really understanding your customer, right? And how to make things adaptable to them, how to serve their needs best. And how do you really bring in that voice of the customer into your process as you're designing and building, right? And so a lot of the times, one of our first steps in deconstruction is really asking questions, not so much about the company, but about who they're serving, right? How much do you actually know your customer? Because that gives us a key on how well or off you are in terms of this journey. Once you have an answer to that, and then you can correlate that to, a couple of buyer journeys you go through, and maybe interview a couple of the customers as well and have them do some of these interviews. There's so many eye-opening conversations that happen in terms of, yeah, that's a cool feature, but we've never used it. And those conversations then really become eye openers for a business to say, wow, we've been putting our time and efforts into things that we thought people wanted, right? So we really come in and question assumptions. It's one of our big, first moves is, let's understand what assumptions you're making about your customers, right? And then let's go and tangibly actually figure this out. And if you were right or not, and the ones that you're not right about, what can be done to change that to fit the customer need, to your question about, overdoing creep, right, of features and stuff, where can you take out some of this stuff? Because, like all these problems at the end of the day become money as well, right? So now you're building features. Somebody has to maintain them. They become, weight in terms of data. They become weight in terms of technological debt of things every software update you're going to have, you're going to need to update that part as well. Nobody's using it. So at the end of the day, you're just creating more work, right, for someone in your team that, could be reduction in time, reduction in headcounts, could be reduction in labor, right? That could be focused in other areas of what you're actually trying to build. So I would say, obvious understanding kind of where that customer is and the values that you have there it's super intrinsic to this process. And the other big one I want to address is the equitability, which honestly, we have seen so much more, right, with all the DEI movement that's happened recently, and particularly being the governance concept, within ESGs, is really understanding how these things are governed, who's getting access to them. And a key component that is really taking off is traceability, but it's based on trust, right? So people want to work with companies or buy from companies or people that they can trust. And building that trust has become extremely critical in terms of having sustainable, resilient paths. Because people, if they trust you as a business, as a consultant, as who you are, they will know and trust that you can get through, a COVID-19 pandemic situation, right? They trust that your business will survive because they understand now that you have built the right empathy, not just with them as customers, but also with your employees, to be able to survive through some of these periods and really build that long-term resilience and sustainability that a business would need.
Wow. There's a lot in there. JP. Thank you.
You threw a lot of them at me.
Yeah, I know, but you
I had to go deep.
You caught all of them and went right into each. So, kudos to you, man. Thanks. That was beautiful. We are at the time right now when we've got a little bit for the Michelle Bach says, made up for lost time. Yeah, just about did. We're pretty much on track. And I haven't seen any questions in the chat, but this is the time when we would open that up to questions if you have them, and we'd love to get them answered by our two experts. So fire away if you've got them, and let's see. If you don't, I would be happy to have these guys add any closing comments in these last few minutes. I'm kind of surprised that some of you don't have any additional thoughts. Additional
Larry,
thoughts are okay too. Yeah.
Yeah, I have a question, but it's can I ask it verbally versus sending you a
Yes,
text?
please.
Okay. So first of all, I'm not surprised, but great panel and a great energy today. But I want to talk about greater forces that you think could change this, and greater forces as the global economy shift to a local economy. I think that's starting to happen in terms of cost of goods. China, Asia dumped a lot of product over the last decade, and as those prices go up, it becomes more practical to reconsider that. So I'd like your just general thoughts about, do you see that as being a shift? And then also the business models. The business models, I think, are as much as we're matchmakers, right? Finding the both ends of this, combined with logistics, and then sprinkle some technology in there. And those are the new general business models, I think, have to be kind of flushed out. But I don't know if there's questions or comments, but I'd love your response to both those.
That's okay. That's good.
I definitely have a reaction right away if that's fine.
Fire away, Garr. Yeah.
Well, I love this idea again of it's the global shift, and I actually wrote about this in an article on Supply Chain Brain, of which I'm happy to post somewhere. But I truly believe we are at the time where the arbitrage that was taking advantage of upstarting economies is coming to an end. And where we're now starting to see it not as a way to mitigate risk to go invest in some cheaper economy, but now it's a way to hedge against risk, to say, okay, you know what, we understand our shores. And this whole reshoring practice, I think, is really going to take hold as we start to bring in, maybe most of these manufacturers won't come back to the US, but they might come back to Mexico. They might come back to economies that are closer to the US, and just generally abroad, they're going to come back to their own domestic shores. Now that's going to be interesting because in a little bit of a remanufacturing sense from my angle, I'm actually uniquely fascinated by, well, what happens when walls start to go up in really interesting trade policy ways, where things aren't as easily moved across borders. Well, that's going to ultimately and kind of hopefully we can overcome the lack of personal relationships and professional relationships that those walls might inhibit. But ultimately, from a local economy perspective, that's going to mean labor boost to domestic manufacturing and remanufacturing, and then ultimately boosting all of the systems that will help keep materials and supplies out of landfill. And that will increase that urban mining concept. That will increase remanufacturing of what can we take out and not send to the container that is landfill, but put into a container that can then be reaggregated and resupplied back into some manufacturer.
Yeah, that's great. That's what I hope, and I believe higher prices will encourage that. And because that's the next to come, right? When you have you're oversupplied, prices go down. When things get expensive, then they'll be. I mean, look at Cuba. They've been remodeling 1950 Chevrolet cars.
Yep.
And
exactly.
And it's working well. It's pretty cool actually that they do that. So
yeah,
thank you.
Yeah, I would agree with you, Jim, in terms of, global shifting to local. I would say, coming from a big corporation where I actually saw this shift start to happen internally, right?
Mhm.
From even, companies that are large and have these large scale manufacturings around the world are really trying to source that locally because it also makes more sense financially,
Yes.
right? I think Garr is right on point with saying it's a de-risk move as well, right? Now you don't have to wait for shipments that are coming from China that take 2 months to get here, right? To really understand, hey, we could actually manufacture some of this local. And there's actually, even though there might be some increase in labor costs, you're actually de-risking a lot of your supply chain as well. So I know you mentioned logistics and supply chain as a big component of this. And I think it's a huge driving force into what is making some of these global versus local decisions. I also think this $70 trillion shift of generational wealth happening, right, to the younger generations is really impacting this because the new consumers, right, are really looking for that local impact. They're really looking for that traceability and saying, well, is it worth $2 less when this got manufactured in China 3 months ago and went through all these horrific practices versus let me buy it for $2 more, where it's been manufactured local and I know that this person actually made it, or I know exactly where that farm is because it's close to my home, right?
Yeah.
So I think there's also a shift in sentiment from the value that we're giving to products. The newer generations are definitely more inclined to the reuse, recycle, owning less, right, as a concept, but they want to own more value, right? So they want to own less stuff, but more valuable, and creating value for companies usually comes in the sense of how does this person attach emotionally to this piece? And that is happening a lot more with localizing versus globalizing some of these products and supply chains, as well as the impact that has on sustainability, right?
Excellent
The
point.
more transparent you make those,
buying behaviors
the better.
are. Yeah, thank you for. And like you said, the buying behaviors, as part of greater forces, is this next generation that maybe is more concerned about this. So that's an excellent point. Thank you very much. Yeah.
Yeah, there's a few studies, and I'm happy to share them, that we've been following in terms of the newer generation, that transfer of wealth, because it's a huge piece about building resilient businesses, right? Is, hey, you've been serving this consumer, there's a whole new wave coming in, and they're coming in rapidly, and they're coming in with $70 trillion. So how are you going to tackle what their needs are going to be before you become obsolete, right? And there's a huge number of stats in terms of what millennials and Gen Zs are looking for that are very different in the value they place. It's like 90% of them prefer something that is sustainable, right? Or that has been gone through a sustainable recycled reuse process versus not. So there are some very big shifts in that demographic.
But did they say greater forces? That's an excellent point. I think about that. Buying behaviors, there's also vogue. It's going to be more vogue to buy this type of buying, especially if they inherit more money to do this. It's not just either to save money. It could be a trend that we hope is for the greater good. So
for the good, yeah, absolutely.
Okay. We are 3 minutes over. Sorry to interrupt there, but because I love the discussion, but we are 3 minutes over and respecting everybody's time. I thank you all for being here. I really thank you, JP and Garr, for participating with such great energy. And despite a few technological hiccups, it was a fabulous discussion, and we got a lot out of it. I think everybody got a lot out of it. about thinking, about the way to think about with empathy and understanding of what is, so that you can merge in with what is, rather than just doing the iron fist of a policy, or just tearing everything out and saying, hey, figure it out and we're going to do this instead. It's much more empathetic and thoughtful and human oriented. So thank you very much for your insights and wisdom, and thanks for tackling Jim's question, because that was a good, solid question and great answers. I'm glad you guys handle those. So,
thank you, Larry. Appreciate you putting this together. Great talk.
my pleasure. Thank you all. So see you next time. And point anybody our way that in cities and counties across America that is thinking about changing how they do things in their city. We'd love to give them a hand. So